The American League opener for 1969. The California Angels and the Seattle Pilots. Good evening, everybody. This is Don Wells with Dick Enberg and Dick Nelson. So good to have you with us from Anaheim Stadium. One of the new entries in the American League in the Western Division, the Seattle Pilots take on the Angels this evening. The Pilots, as part of the pregame ceremonies, have just been introduced. First of all, their starting lineup, then Joe Schultz, then the rest of the squad. And now the introduction of the starting nine for the California Ball Club, managed by Bill Rigney. So what can you possibly say? I have been privileged to be on hand now for all of the Angels openers since 1961. And I have to say that this is one that I have certainly looked forward to, and I think that's mainly because of the men who are in blue, the Seattle Pilots. Expansion in the American League and the creation of divisional play. And it certainly should be the outstanding year in the American League of all time. This is the centennial year for baseball.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hiya, friends. It's Tim Hanlon. How are you? Thank you so much for finding our little show in the wilds of podcast land, and we greatly appreciate you finding it and listening and hopefully enjoying our conversation this week here on Good Seats Still Available. It's our curious little podcast, our journey each week, our excursion, if you will, into what used to be in professional sports. And perhaps the most quintessential example of what we're all about on this little show is encompassed in today's episode. And we're in the realm of baseball again. We're happy to be back, even though it's the off season, a little hot stove. We've got that fire burning to keep going into some teams and some leagues within the realm of baseball. No longer with us for whatever reasons, and we can't think of a better one than one that's been sort of itching at us for quite some time, even frankly when we all the way back from when we started this show almost 2 years ago. And that's the Seattle Pilots of 1969, the American League for that matter. And that clip that you just heard was from their very first major league regular season game. They were playing at the California Angels. And the date was April 8th, 1969. The voice you just heard there was Don Wells calling the game. He also with Dick Enberg, which you don't hear in that clip, but was his partner in crime, if you will, with the Angels broadcasts on KMPC Radio, 710 on your AM dial. And of course, if you dial that up now, you're going to hear nothing but Korean language programming. But back then in 69, it was the flagship Gene Autry owned 50,000 watt and then some flamethrower of Angels baseball all across the Southland, and I'm sure an extensive affiliate lineup of stations. But they were calling that first game. It was obviously the season opener, not only for the Angels, but the franchise opener for the Seattle Pilots. And that is the topic of our conversation today. The one-year wonder, the 1969 season, the only season of the Seattle Pilots of the American League. Our guest this week is Bill Mullins. He is the author of perhaps the most wide-ranging and expansive investigation of the story of the Seattle Pilots. It's called Becoming Big League, Seattle, the Pilots, and Stadium Politics. Came out a couple of years ago in University of Washington Press. And it's a great survey. Not only it does talk about the team and what transpired on the field a bit, but it also has a much longer arc as the story, as we're going to unwind in our conversation in a few seconds here, goes back to literally the beginnings of the 1960s. Things like the World's Fair of '62 and sort of the rumblings around building a stadium and trying to attract a professional sports team to Seattle, which during the 60s really was the third, I think, most populous metropolitan area on the West Coast, and yet was effectively bereft of anything professional sports at that time. And we're going to get into sort of the reasons why sports franchises of a major league variety were part of the Seattle zeitgeist, or at least in certain circles of Seattle in terms of its becoming quote unquote major league, the fits and starts of such, and frankly, the groundwork that kind of helped lead to Major League Baseball awarding a franchise, and we're going to get to the timing of that, which is pretty interesting. The team that became the Seattle Pilots in 1969, and let's put it this way, it wasn't a raging success, okay? The team itself wasn't all that bad. I think a lot of people who were there in 69 in Seattle have some very fond memories of the team. We're going to sort of end our show with a little bit of even a theme song, which you want to stick around for, because I think it was a very interesting time for Seattle and sports fans. But let's put it this way: there were a bunch of elements there that sort of conspired against the team. Some of which of its own doing, actually a lot of it of its own doing. Some of which actually was not of its own doing. Stadium politics for sure, and a whole host of other sort of things that made the Pilots' adventure in 1969 one for the record books. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today, this week, with our guest Bill Mullins coming up in a couple of seconds. So stay tuned. It's very enjoyable. And of course, as always, very educational. I learned a whole bunch, and I think you will as well. And I think it's appropriate that we not only welcome you to the proceedings, but we also welcome, yes, a brand new sponsor to our ever-growing roster of folks supporting our show. And we appreciate our new friends at Streaker Sports for stepping up to the plate, if you will, and being a sponsor of our show. And we're ecstatic, especially this week, because not only do they have great shirts and wear of teams and leagues and a lot of great sports history stuff at streakersports.com this week, it's appropriate because they have a beautiful 1969 replica Seattle Pilots T-shirt in all kinds of different sizes. It's in baby blue. It's a gorgeous color, and it's got that original and frankly somewhat iconic Pilots logo. We talk about it a little bit with Bill in a couple of seconds here in our chat. But it's a great logo. It's one of the better ones, I think, in modern baseball history. And it is yours for the purchase at streakersports.com. And of course, before you make that purchase, before you check out, make sure you use the promo code GOODSEATS and get 10% off. Not only that purchase, but anything on streakersports.com. And we, again, thank them for being part of our little broadcast, and we thank you for checking them out. That's streakersports.com, and again, that promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases when you go there early and often. And thank you, Streaker Sports. We look forward to more fun and frivolity with you, hopefully, as the year progresses, and I'm sure we got some great promotional concepts between us to bring to you, our beloved listeners. And well, this is not why you came to listen to us, to hear us spout promotional stuff, but we appreciate you checking it out. You came to listen to great conversations around teams and leagues, no longer with us, and this is our attempt this week to do so. And this is our chat that we had just at the end of the calendar year of 2018 with our new friend Bill Mullins, and we're talking about the Seattle Pilots of 1969. And here's our chat coming up. So we've been doing the show for about a year and a half, and as I think I've told you on an email, the idea is to sort of focus on stories and teams and leagues no longer around, defunct or otherwise relocated or whatever. And when I originally envisioned this show, one of those teams that struck me as sort of an everlasting enigma, right, was or is this 1 year wonder that is and was the Seattle Pilots. So I'm enthralled with the topic, and I'm ecstatic that we could use your book as the excuse to have an interview, at least, or an introductory conversation, I guess, would probably be a more layered conversation about the Pilots. Before we get into it, though, maybe you could give our audience a sense of who you are, what your background is, and how you stumbled across this story enough to devote a hefty tome to it.
Sure. I'm a retired professor of history. My specialty is in American history. I taught most of my career at Oklahoma Baptist University, and actually the pursuit of the historical degree and the opportunity to teach is where the story of the book starts, at any rate. I came to the University of Washington to get my MA and PhD in history, and of course, it was in 1968, 69, and then 69 is the year that the Pilots played. I got to see the Pilots in a couple of games, and then went home. And by the time I made it back, there were no more Pilots. So as I came to the end of my career, I retired from Oklahoma Baptist University. We planned to move back to the Northwest. I figured I needed something to do in order to occupy my time, and I thought it would be really nice to research and write a book. And I thought the Pilots would be just the perfect thing. I'm a big baseball fan. I think I've been a Dodger fan probably since I was 8 years old, and I've followed baseball all of my life. And so putting my hobby interest together with my profession, I thought the Pilots would be a really good subject. I kind of researched around and found out that there was a book that had already been written about the Pilots, but it concentrated on primarily the on-the-field story of the Pilots. It didn't lack for commentary on what happened to them and some of the business things, but it was a baseball book. And what I wanted to do was to write a book about the business of baseball and as you said, the unusual situation of the Pilots leaving the city after just 1 year of existence. So I began researching after we moved to the Seattle area. And as I began the research, I realized that the story really could be told more broadly even than the business end of the Pilots, that in fact it could be something of a history of Seattle. And so I've tried to include that and urban history, a history of baseball on the field and everything in between. For sure, the story of the origin of the Pilots and the disappearance of the team and some of the reasons for the way that it all occurred over really a process of several years.
Well, the Pilots obviously was a 1969 baseball season story, but as your book sort of circles around the beginnings of the narrative and sort of the setup of what ultimately happened, it actually goes way back earlier in the decade, right, to the World's Fair, and maybe that's a good place to kind of lay a little groundwork for our audience about sort of, what of Seattle and its history, its fledglingness, I guess, as a desirable place not only to live, but its own desire to perhaps, I guess, my words, fancy itself more major league, so to speak, and maybe you can kind of give us a little starting point as to sort of how this narrative gets going.
Right. In the book, I go, in fact, even before the World's Fair, I go back to 1960 when there was actually a bond issue vote in 1960 for a stadium. Not that many people were interested in it. I divide the city up into three major players in the Pilot story anyway. There's the boosters, there's the civic leaders, and there's the politicians. And truthfully, only the boosters were interested in a stadium for a Major League Baseball team and maybe for the University of Washington Husky football team in 1960. The campaign was modest. There were a few bumper stickers. There were only 3 or 4 people who really beat the drum for the bond issue. And when the people voted, they voted against it. It only got a 48% vote, and in the state of Washington, it takes 60% for a bond issue to be passed. So it fell well short of any possibility. And then the World's Fair is where the excitement began to pick up. I think Seattle began to realize that it was a big city. When I came to it in 1968, I came from Southern California, the Los Angeles area, and the overwhelming sense was, here is a large city that doesn't know it's a large city. And I think there were plenty of people in the Puget Sound region who kind of wanted to keep it that way. But when the World's Fair ended up being a real success, not only the boosters but some other people began to get a vision for what can we do next. And one of those things that might come from that, they thought, was a baseball team, an expansion team, or maybe lure another team to Seattle. And so they got busy on it. In 1964, Gabe Paul and William Daley of the Cleveland Indians came to Seattle, kind of testing it out to see if the Indians might move to Seattle. Probably it was a ploy to leverage some favorable stadium improvements in Cleveland, but they looked around. They found out there was nothing but a minor league stadium, and they went back home and negotiated with the city of Cleveland and got pretty much what they wanted. But that really piqued the interest, I think, of a lot of baseball fans in Seattle. But it wasn't until 1966 and the possibility of the National Football League bringing a team to Seattle that they began working again on a bond issue. And that one looked like it was pretty much going to be accepted. It just seemed like everybody had endorsed it. The politicians endorsed it. Bankers endorsed it. The newspapers endorsed it. Even the religious community endorsed the bond issue with kind of an eye toward a Billy Graham crusade as soon as the stadium opened up. But it seemed to run into some rough going. The fellow who was the leader of the campaign did kind of a debate with people who were not so much for it. And though he had been speaking articulately throughout the city for the bond issue, he just seemed to fall down in this not televised, but it was on the radio, this debate, and he couldn't really explain very well why a private entity did not build a stadium, whether or not the stadium would be built if there was no team coming, where the stadium might be placed in the city. And it seemed like the momentum for approval for that bond issue just turned around several weeks before the bond election. And so in 1966, the bond issue for a stadium fell short of the 60%. It was over 50%, but it still wasn't enough. In the meantime, Charlie Finley came to town because he was looking for a place for his Kansas City A's. And he was pretty interested in Seattle, but he was also interested in Oakland and maybe in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He negotiated a little bit. The politicians were not very encouraging. The mayor, when he came, negotiated pretty hard-nosed. But what Finley wanted was an option to leave the city if the city did not vote positively for a stadium, because there was a third election for a stadium in 1968, and he was looking in 1967, and so he wanted to make an agreement that if the bond issue went down in 1968, he could leave for somewhere else, and that just wasn't really workable. Again, that spurred people's interest that an owner, a major league owner, was looking at Seattle for a location for his team, and so in 1968 there was a kind of a multiple bond issue. It included rapid transit, money for an aquarium, parks, city improvement, infrastructure improvement, and a stadium that, became the Kingdome, $40 million for the Kingdome. And this time, 1968, I think Seattle had grown up just a little bit more than 1960. I think that they saw a real possibility of a team pretty close in the future, and so Seattle voted for the Kingdome, the $40 million for the Kingdome in February 1968. So things were looking pretty good. And by that time, this is another part of the story, but by that time, the American League had granted Seattle a franchise pending a positive vote on the Kingdome.
So why? So let's back up for a second. So why do you think the '60s was so jagged? I guess in terms of this sort of on again, off again, fits and starts, sort of almost circular discussion around anything relating to pro sports and a facility or facilities necessary to attract it. It seems like there was sort of a very hot and cold kind of civic feeling around the idea maybe of a pro sports franchise and or footing the bill for such. And I'm wondering what the debate was, I guess, civically about the pluses and minuses of such.
Well, I think it was kind of a matter of recruiting. The boosters, they had been excited for a stadium since 1960, and what they succeeded in doing was to draw more and more people into their orbit for a stadium. But Seattle was pretty much a hard sell. I think the people of Seattle were not really interested in paying higher property taxes to build a stadium, and there were a lot of people who held out even into 1968. But more and more people saw the possibility, and it was always sold not as a moneymaker, but as something that would make Seattle big time, and that's part of the title of the book, is Becoming Big League. And so this was a process of becoming, and I think more and more people gained a vision of what Seattle could be or what it was actually becoming between 1960 and 1968, and it seemed to accelerate, say, from 1966 to 68. Seattle is not a red-hot baseball town, even today. And in those days, as far as a sports city, it was Husky football all the way. In fact, the two major things were Husky football and the hydroplane races in the summer on Lake Washington. And with the beginning of the interest of the National Football League, I think more Seattleites were interested, were open to the possibility of paying some taxes so that a sports stadium could be built. And so the combination of baseball and football, I think, really made a difference. But even by 1968, I think Seattle was somewhere just a little bit beyond lukewarm for a baseball team and for paying for a baseball stadium. I did a little bit of statistical analysis, and what I found was that the folks who were blue-collar workers, who were kind of middle class to lower middle class, were the ones who were the most resistant to voting for the stadium. The people, interestingly, the people who are well off, I think they saw it as kind of a civic advancement, and they voted for the stadium. The people who are not so well off were still willing to tax themselves for something that maybe they enjoyed, and the people in the middle came reluctantly to voting for a stadium. And I think, as you put it, that it seems like it starts and stops, but I think it's a progressive recruitment of this middle group, more and more of them coming to supporting a team, to building a stadium. And again, when the Pilots were here, I really doubt that the middle class was fully on board for having to pay for a stadium or shelling out for a ticket to go to a baseball game more than once during the season.
Well, that's interesting too. There's also another sort of angle to this, right? The 60s, especially sort of the latter half of the decade, right, where it was almost sort of this, maybe the beginnings of an awakening, I guess, on professional sports around things like expansion, right? The great expansion of NHL in 67, 68. You had the beginnings of the American Basketball Association, the first of what became just a litany of challenger leagues that went way into the 70s. You're mentioning the potential outreach of the NFL. Obviously, baseball had expanded albeit pretty slowly. And 1967 also was the arrival of, wait for it, the Seattle Supersonics of the NBA. Now, granted, not the NBA of what we know today, right? Sort of much more of I won't say looser collective, but certainly was. But it was basketball. It was one of the big four major sports leagues, right? And in many respects, right, it had to be a shot in the arm to Seattle's culture and various elements of the economic fabric of the city to kind of give it, if you will, literally and figuratively, some major league status that might then now also perhaps mean more interest in other pro sports too.
Right, and the Sonics are a part of the story. I'm not sure how important, but they're there. The Sonics were the first major league team that came to Seattle because they made it to Seattle in 1967. They came the way a number of teams came to Seattle. There was ownership that was out of the city, and they brought a team to Seattle, and that's kind of the way the Pilots came as well. Again, this group of people who I call the boosters, they were always talking to the American League or the National League about having a team, but the politicians were just totally quiet about that. There was no group beating the drum, and the civic leaders, the people who are the business folk in downtown, they welcomed sports. They did have that feeling. They were convinced by the boosters that having a major league team would make the city a major league city, a big league city. But they weren't willing to just really work for it. There were comparisons throughout this whole story of the rise and the fall of the Pilots, of how if this had been in, and then put in your city, Kansas City, if this would have been in Anaheim, if this would have been in my city, said major league owners, we would have raised money in 10 days. And that just never happened in Seattle. Boeing is one of the parts of it. Boeing is kind of a curious part of Seattle. It's what made Seattle in those days. It was really a company town in the 1960s. Boeing was everything, but Boeing really held itself aloof from Seattle culture, from Seattle politics, from Seattle charity. Boeing said, well, we have a lot of employees and they will be active in your city, and that will be our contribution to the city. But there was nobody that was a part of Boeing that took the lead in recruiting the Sonics, the Seahawks, or the Pilots to Seattle. And without Boeing, that's an important economic aspect that just goes missing from the story of bringing sports to what was really a big city.
Yeah, right. It was I still think it is. Well, I don't know geographically now, but at the time, right, it was the third largest population center on the West Coast, right, outside of the two big cities in California.
Right, and it was the 15th largest media market in the entire United States.
Yeah, I mean,
so it was due for major league sports.
Yeah,
by numbers.
Yeah, and that again, and having lived there for a period of time too, there is how can I best put it? A provincial quality to Seattle, which I think is and the Pacific Northwest generally, which I think is an amazing not only curiosity but admirable sort of spirit. But I also. Again, this is against the backdrop of expansion and pro sports, and it's just interesting to sort of hear sort of the general, ambivalence, I guess, on certain levels around this. But yet, it didn't stop entities from pushing the baseball thing, and I guess the way you describe it, you have your boosters that are sort of making some inroads. Maybe we can get a little closer to the lead up to the actual formation and the events sort of surrounding the creation of this franchise. Maybe you can want to delve into the sort of like the 1967, 66, 67-ish kind of lead up period, because it seems to me that the chief cook and bottle washer behind this franchise was literally a baseball guy, one, very much entrenched with a relatively successful minor league team in Seattle, the Pacific Coast League, of the Rainiers. Maybe give us a story of sort of how he sort of came about, and I guess, without very much money, kind of became kind of the central leader of all this.
Well, he certainly was the local face of the Pilots, and we're talking about Dewey Soriano, who was really a pretty good baseball fellow. In the book, I kind of sketch out a possibility of him becoming commissioner of baseball. It didn't work that way, but he had been a general manager of a couple of minor league teams when the Pilots were created. He was the president of the Pacific Coast League, and he and his brother were really important people in I guess financing the Pilots and getting them all set up. The story really kind of goes back to Charlie Finley wandering around looking for a place to move his Kansas City A's. He was really upset with Kansas City. They had promised him some things, but not on paper. They had reneged on those promises, and being the kind of blustering fellow that he wasn't going to fool around with Kansas City anymore. He wanted a new place. And as I said, he had looked at Seattle, but wasn't able to come to any agreement that he was satisfied with, and so he ended up in Oakland. The American League gave him permission to move to Oakland, and Senator Stuart Symington, who was one of the senators from Missouri, told the American League that he would campaign as hard as he could in the Senate to end baseball's antitrust exemption. And that's one of the most precious things that the baseballers prize for themselves, the Major League Baseball prizes for itself, and so they got busy right away, and they expanded or voted an expansion team to Kansas City, and they needed another one to balance it out, and they voted one for Seattle. Again, the boosters had always been talking to American League officials, Joe Cronin, the president of the American League particularly, about the possibility of a team in Seattle, but it was really the American League that pursued Seattle as much as Seattle pursuing the American League. At that particular meeting, when the vote was taken in 1967, there were one or two city officials, but not the mayor, not the head of the county council. They were minor officials, and the American League just kind of hauled off and said, "Seattle, you're it." Symington pressed them to start the team in Kansas City and Seattle in 1969. So there was only there was just a one-season lead time for them to get ready, and for sure for Seattle, that just wasn't enough. Well, so it's really a case. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so Symington, right? So this is it's ironic, right? Because you had Finley kind of leaving Kansas City, and yet you have the senator from the state of Missouri who's pushing to deal with the loss of this A's franchise with a replacement franchise literally the next season in '68. It seems to me that Symington, was unwittingly almost the undermining force of what became the Pilots' only season, but it was because he wanted to have that Kansas City. So here's the thing: my understanding is that the original expansion of the new Kansas City, what became the Royals franchise, and the Seattle Pilots weren't supposed to start until 1971. But it was because of Symington that all of it, both teams, were pushed up to 68 because he was fearful of losing Kansas City as a baseball market altogether.
That's right. Symington just kind of laid it down, is that he wouldn't relent unless the season started. The team was in place by 68, but the season doesn't start until the 1969 season. And that just wasn't enough preparation time for Dewey Soriano and the other people that were working with him. We'll get into this story in just a moment, but the stadium that they played in was the minor league stadium in Seattle. It's called Sick Stadium, named for Adolf Sick, who was a Rainiers brewery head who had owned the Rainiers baseball team for some long time, the minor league team. And the stadium just wasn't ready by opening day in 1969, but there were all kinds of complications that they had to work through to even get it close to being ready.
Before we get into the season, though, maybe I would circle back on Soriano, because this was not a guy who had the dough, right? I mean, he had the wherewithal to sort of become sort of the face and the manager, and albeit a baseball pro, right, around the team, which is great. But maybe you can give our audience a sense of sort of how the money came about to sort of fund and or manage, if you will, the franchise. It wasn't from his sources, was it?
No, it really wasn't. The American League had recruited him, and it didn't seem like there was anybody else in Seattle or anywhere who wanted to own the team. And so the first announcement was that the Soriano brothers had recruited all local people, and that they would be fully funded, and it would be local ownership. And all of that was untrue. It turned out that Sorianos had some money, but the person that the Sorianos had to go to was the former owner of the Cleveland Indians, William Daley. When Daley had come to Seattle to kind of look at it in 1964, he must have been impressed, because he was willing to put in a good deal of his money to own the Pilots. He had a 47% stake, and that was by far the largest stake that anybody had in the Pilots. And so it was Bill Daley's team. Again, a former owner, so everybody in the lodge knew the fellow, and they were happy with that. Most people knew the Soriano brothers. Dewey was the leader. Max, his brother, helped him along, and so that was pretty good to have the Sorianos as the Seattle representatives of the team. And then there were other just minor owners, both in Cleveland and in Seattle. But Bill Daley was the man who owned the Pilots, and that's really important.
Did you get any? I'm sorry. Did you get any sense of sort of how that sort of little bromance happened? I mean, obviously Daley coming to Seattle to kind of sniff out the market, maybe for the Indians. But I mean, any other backstory as to like how they created a friendship, and or a couple of years later where it was enough where Soriano could literally broach the idea of literally becoming the major minority owner of this team?
It really seems as though it's merely a business partnership. It's not like a long-standing friendship. I think the Sorianos probably reached out to try to contact somebody who had enough money. It could be that somebody in the American League offices got these guys in touch. But Daley, just as he appeared on the scene, said that he really wouldn't mind working with the Sorianos, and the way that he put it, to me, made it sound like they've got a good reputation. I'm willing to work with these guys, and we'll get to know one another as we go down the road. Very interesting.
Well, okay, so that, but it didn't seem to be, well, okay. So the money is there, at least in the beginning, it seems, and but the time, as you pointed out before, is now not on their side, right? There is literally no time to waste to kind of get this franchise up and running to begin the 1969 season. Which how does that happen, right? It doesn't seem like it allows for very much in the way of quality or infrastructure. And I mean, you mentioned the stadium, but what of that, and what else in the months that led up? It seems like it was almost. I don't know, shall we say doomed from the start? But maybe I'm going certainly
ahead. Wasn't auspicious, and they made some interesting headway in trying to lure Seattleites into the into the stadium. They had a name the team contest. There were a variety of names that were suggested, like the Green Sox, the Rainiers, the Mariners, and some others, but it was pretty clear that pilots would be a pretty good pick if you were a part of this contest, because Dewey Soriano, as well as being a baseball man, was a harbor pilot. And so it wasn't a surprise to the press relations fellow that pilots ended up being the name for the team. And it's kind of clever because it denotes both the waterborne aspect, the Puget Sound and the Pacific Ocean for being a pilot, but also the Boeing connection. And so the logo was a ship's steering wheel with a baseball in the middle with a couple of little angel wings off to the side to make people think of both airline pilots and seagoing pilots as well.
It's a great. I mean, for those logo nerds out there who listen to this show, it's charming, and I think the charm continues. I think even more so because it only lasted for a year. But it's a very cool logo, and it's a very interesting dynamic of how you sort of blend those two or those three sort of dimensions together all in one.
That's right, and the uniforms reflected that as well. The uniforms were gold and blue. The sleeves had stripes, like a airline pilot or a ship's captain. But the main thing were the caps. A nice S on the cap, but on the bill of the cap was the gold braid, the scrambled eggs, as they call it. It was a captain's cap that the players wore. And I think that's the best part probably of the pilot's history is the caps of the pilots. Getting into the stadium part, there was a long argument with the city. The city had bought Sick's Stadium by 1968, and so the negotiations went on between Dewey Soriano and the mayor, Dorm Bremen. They were long, they were grueling. Bremen gave Soriano a deal as they negotiated that really wasn't quite as good as the deal that Charlie Finley refused to embrace. The pilots had to pay $165,000 a year for 5 years, and there was just no way that they would be in Sick's Stadium for 5 years. 4 years would have been the maximum had things gone the way they were supposed to go. So they were paying a year's premium in order to get the lease. And the city in return would pay just over $1.1 million in order to install enough seats. Nobody seems to know how many seats there were in the minor league Sick's Stadium. 11,000 is the number that most people use, and the American League wanted 28,000 seats to be placed in Sick's Stadium. That was going to be hard to do in a period of now less than a year, and they couldn't begin the construction. They couldn't even draw up plans until Soriano and the mayor Bremen had finished negotiating, and they negotiated and negotiated, finally came up with a deal, and even then the city council almost didn't vote for it. One of the councilmen said, well, all of this money, it should go for a library in a suburb of one of the neighborhoods of Seattle. It passed, but it didn't pass easily. And so it was pretty deep into October when they began the renovations on Sick's Stadium. And you, having lived in Seattle, and anybody that's been in Seattle, know that, boy, if you begin construction in October, it's going to be hard. It's going to be really, really wet. It might be cold, but there's going to be a lot of mud, not just dirt, to deal with. And that turned out to be the case. The other problem was that they were working on a consultant's estimate of how much it would cost. And when they sent out the bids came in at 65% above that estimate. And so they had to negotiate again on what the stadium was going to be like. The 28,000 seats came down to 25,000 seats. The quality of the lighting of the field was reduced. It wasn't, well, I guess it was major league quality, but just barely. Plywood was used wherever plywood could be used rather than sturdier structures to renovate the field. And I'm not sure if it was true or not, but Bob Short, who was the owner of the then Washington Senators, when he came to see Sick's Stadium with his team, he said that the box seats were nothing more than a bunch of metal folding chairs like you'd find at a funeral home. Nobody said that the stadium measured up to major league standards as the season went on. The American League never signed off on Sick's Stadium as something that it approved of, and there were other problems. The new seats that they put in began to warp midway through the season. As they put in the seats, it wasn't until the second homestand that all of the 25,000 seats had been installed. And as I was saying earlier, when people came to opening day, if they came really early, they could still hear the hammers ringing as bleachers were being put into place for probably what was around 19,000 seats for opening day. At the second homestand, some of the fans kind of looked at their clothing and they had blue stains on it. The paint wasn't dry yet from the seats that they were sitting in, and finally the installer of the seats had to pay the cleaning bill or pay for new suits for the people who had picked up that paint on their clothing. And as the season went on, it turned out the water pressure wasn't sufficient. When there was just a little bit over average attendance, around the seventh inning, the water pressure dropped dramatically. There's a story of Joe Pepitone, the first baseman for the Yankees, left the game early, went into the clubhouse, the visiting clubhouse, to shower. And he came running out of the clubhouse all soaped up into the restaurant area, I hope wearing a towel, yelling about what happened to the water. There was no hot water. The water pressure was so low. And it turned out that the water main that went into the stadium was a 6-inch water main, and for the stadium it was necessary to have an 8-inch water main. They didn't change that until the season had come to a close. In order to activate the lights for a night game, somebody had to climb up one of the poles in order to get them going. There were clogs that affected, I think, sand that got into the electronics of the PA system, and at least once a fire broke out in an electrical box because it had shorted out. And so all of those problems afflicted the pilots as they went on, and Dewey Soriano made a big deal out of it. It would have been a good idea to make a big deal with the city, but not make a big deal in the newspapers, because that meant that the fans were reading about what a crummy stadium it was, and it was kind of less likely that they would come out to sit on, bleachers that were warping, that had no backs, in a stadium that was not really properly constructed. So that was really a problem. One more problem that I think Soriano brought on himself was the ticket prices. The pilots had among the highest ticket prices in all of the major leagues. Their highest ticket was $6. The next highest was like $4 in San Francisco. Their cheap tickets were $2.50 when you could see a Yankee game for 75 cents in the far reaches of Yankee Stadium. One of the newspaper reporters really reacted well when he said, "Great Soriano, where are the cheap seats?" And there just weren't cheap seats in Sick's Stadium. And I think that Soriano kind of had an idea that because it was Major League Baseball, he could charge more and the people would come out even with higher charges. And that was a really serious miscalculation.
All right, time for me to catch my breath, get a cool, tasty beverage, and remind you, while we do so, that our friends at Audible are here to remind you that you can get a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and use that link, of course, to try for yourself a free audiobook on us, gratis, if you will. And you will love the idea of audiobooks. It's an awesome way to kill time and occupy and stimulate your mind, perhaps when your eyes are busy doing something else. And of course, there are plenty of interesting books to be found, especially in the world of sports and sports history. I think our audience might enjoy a few of these, of course, including the seminal work by baseball legend Jim Bouton. It's called Ball 4. It is not only written, but it's also narrated by him. You could use your free credit for that book. And of course, as you know, Ball 4 centers around the 1969 one-year wonder that is the Seattle Pilots of Major League Baseball, but obviously the background for a whole lot of other observations about the sport of baseball. And it remains to this day perhaps one of the most celebrated writings about the sport of baseball in this country. Of course, you can also, if you're not a big baseball fan, you can go into the world of soccer with the autobiography called My Turn by Johan Cruyff, the late Johan Cruyff, perhaps one of the world's best ever soccer players. He of Dutch heritage, of course. Plenty of great legendary years at club play as well as national team play for the Dutch team, as well as, for our audience, maybe a little bit of interest, his journeys in the North American Soccer League in the late 70s and early 80s with the Washington Diplomats and the Los Angeles Aztecs. And of course, if you're into football, there's probably no better book, especially if you find yourself really interested in the sort of deep and rich history of the NFL, with the book called NFL Football, A History of America's New National Pastime. It is written by Richard Crepeau and narrated by Marlon May. That, too, is an audiobook that you could choose from over, like I said, 180,000 titles. There's got to be something in there that's going to be of interest to you. And by all means, give it a try. And we appreciate your doing so at audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you're going to get your free audiobook download. You can cancel it anytime. And again, even if you cancel it, you can keep that book as long as your device exists. So again, we appreciate it. Give it a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation.
So what Sick's Stadium, right? This is not like a brand new, even temporary facility, right? It had been around for many years, right? As the main,
since 1938,
right? For the Rainiers, right? So there had to be some basic level of, capability and infrastructure there, right? I mean, it was obviously being asked to become larger and more, quote unquote, major league appropriate, but all these stories about the water and all this other, I mean, is that just simply because it was being asked and or pushed to become something bigger than it was maybe capable of becoming structurally?
That's exactly it. Yeah. Again, the water pressure was a problem when it was just a little bit over average attendance. That level of attendance, around 8,000, I think, was not likely to come out for a minor league game. So it wasn't ever a problem when the numbers were that low. And again, if it was 11,000 seats, it was really an unusual game that would tax the water supply. In the case of the Pilots, there were a number of nights and days when there were so many fans and fans using the restrooms and so on that the water just wasn't enough.
All right. So another question then is: was it always envisioned that the Sick's Stadium would be a temporary venue while this Kingdome, or I don't know if it was named by then during the bidding or the voting? And what was the timing of this new stadium supposed to be? Because it seems like, if at least people could agree that this was a temporary solution for a set period of time, we can kind of all get around this. And ultimately we know what the goal in mind is, which is the ultimate new stadium. But it seems like even that wasn't sort of fully figured out, maybe because of some of the negotiations that were going on around Sick's Stadium.
The American League put into its provisions for the Seattle Pilots that construction would have to begin before the end of 1970 it was called for a long time the King County Multipurpose Stadium, and finally just commonly called the Kingdome. And so,
sorry, were they worried it actually wouldn't get started, even though it was voted in?
It was one of those things of what happens if there's construction problems. And 1970 was really pretty generous because the vote was in February 1968. And so construction really had to get started by 1970 if things were to go along right. And again, the Pilots were kind of forced into a 5-year lease on Sick's Stadium, but I think they thought they would be out in 4 and maybe even in 3 years. And it turned out the Kingdome ground wasn't broken until 1972, and the stadium wasn't finished until 1976. So the big hope that the Sorianos and that Bill Daly had of getting out of Sick's Stadium into a real major league stadium and with adequate seating, with large seating, 40,000 plus seats. The big hope began to just kind of go further and further off into the distance. There was a whole big wrangle about where the Kingdome was going to be built. The consultants suggested that it be built somewhat south of the city in an industrial area because it would cost less there. The civic leaders came alive and said, "No, you're not going to do that. We need to have a stadium that's downtown. We can't take the stadium out of downtown." And so they suggested the site of the Seattle World's Fair, now the Seattle Center, that the stadium be built there, really near where what is today Key Arena, the old Seattle Coliseum where the Sonics played, so that it would be all just right in the downtown area. In the state of Washington, there's the initiative process. You get enough signatures on a petition, you can vote on almost anything. And there was a real outcry about building the Kingdome at the Seattle Center, partly because it would spoil the center with this huge building, partly because there would almost surely be cost overruns over the $40 million that the people had voted. And so the petition was circulated. It got enough signatures. In 1970, after the Pilots had left, there was a vote, and the Seattle Center site was rejected by the people of Seattle, and they had to go through the siting process once again. So there are all kinds of difficulties in moving from Sick's to the Kingdome because there are all kinds of difficulties in getting the Kingdome built.
All right, so I got 2 more questions related to this. Was there any other place besides Sick's Stadium that could have been a temporary location for this team, say in 1970, if there had been a second season, or in any of the following seasons, given the delay in this Kingdome site selection process and construction process? Or was there no other choice in this city?
There really was no other choice. The only other large stadium in the city was Husky Stadium, and Husky Stadium was it wasn't a real possibility for baseball.
Yeah, because it was a football-centric construction.
Yeah, I mean the Coliseum was sort of worked for the Dodgers, but Husky Stadium wasn't the Coliseum. It wasn't as large a place. So there was no place to go. The argument, the discussion as the Pilots were beginning to leave was a discussion over who was going to pay for further renovations to make Sick's Stadium, let's say, equivalent to Seal Stadium in San Francisco, where the Giants played for at least a year, maybe 2 years, before they went to Candlestick.
All right, here's the last question on that one then. So, and this is sort of a little forwarding to the story, but like after the team has left for a bunch of reasons we'll get into in a second, was there any? What was the thinking then once the team had left? Was there anything that then caused certain people in the mixture to pause the thought about the stadium? I mean, they had lost the team, right? And yet the stadium had been voted in prior to the team's arrival or during the team's arrival. And now the team was gone. So I'm wondering if people sort of had some remorse about following through with this stadium now that the team had left. Or did they kind of redouble their efforts and go, you know what, if we don't build this stadium, we're never going to have a shot at anything professional, baseball or otherwise?
And this is the real flip-flop in the Seattle political landscape. A city that was, like I said, just a little bit beyond lukewarm for a stadium, for a team. It really changed around, and I think it owed to just one individual. John Spellman became the county executive. That's sort of like being the mayor of the county, and the stadium was a county undertaking. So it was his responsibility, and amazingly enough, he didn't blink an eye. He said, yeah, we're going to build this building even without a team. We're going to be searching for a team as we build it, but he didn't hesitate at all to continue the building process. And I give him a lot of credit because I'm a baseball fan, and I think that building the stadium was a good thing to do. I give him a lot of credit for forging ahead when almost the rest of the Seattle city political landscape probably would have just thrown up their hands and put the money in the bank for some later day.
It's all very interesting. All right, so let's get into and we don't have to go through sort of the on-field stuff, but I know your book does touch on some of the issues. But I guess at some point, God forbid, we'll be able to get. I'd love to get Jim Bouton before he just sort of gives up doing interviews, and there are a bunch of other sort of players and related sort of things that we can do, hopefully, to get more about sort of the on-field performance and all that kind of stuff. But maybe you can sort of give our audience a sense of encapsulating, I guess, sort of what this season was all about, because you had high ticket prices. It wasn't the least attended team in the major leagues, but it was fairly close. It was about fifth. Yeah, and the on-field performance was not bad. I mean, it was not great, but they weren't sort of complete. They didn't lose every game, right? How did the season sort of unfold, and sort of when did the wheels truly come off, and why, in your estimation?
Well, for an expansion team, it didn't go badly through July. They would have winning streaks, they would have losing streaks. Into July, into the very first part of August, they were in third place in the Western Division. Joe Schultz just he's the manager, made an offhand comment of, I think this team could end up in third place. He really wished the rest of the season he had never said that, because the general manager, Marvin Milks, pretty well held him to it. Milks was not type A, he was type A+, and wanted to win at all costs, not the kind of general manager that an expansion team really needs to have. But he really pressed Schultz on his third place prediction, and they held third place, amazingly enough, behind Oakland and Minnesota those years until July, and then the wheels did come off in August. And I think the reason was that the pilots in the expansion draft had drafted mainly older name players. By the expansion draft, I think the Pilots front office, that Soriano knew that he was in some trouble luring fans to the ballpark, and that he needed names in order to get them there. So there's Don Mincher and Tommy Davis and Gary Bell and Steve Barber, who hopefully would be recognizable enough names to come to the ballpark. But the problem with that is that these older guys began to break down as the season came to a close, and there were plenty of people on the disabled list or just sitting out a few days by August and September. That combined with the fact that The Pilots had to play Baltimore and Detroit a large number of times in August and September. Meant that the season just crashed. The Pilots finished last in the Western Division, again, they were kind of a representative team. Interestingly enough, they had the same record. The Pilots had the same record as the Mariners did their first year. So Seattle by then by the time the Mariners had come, were probably used to teams that were losing upwards to 100 games. I think the Cleveland Indians had more losses than the Pilots, but the Pilots were second to the last in the American League.
So what was going on during the season in terms of marketing and I guess maybe the story of the team? Like how much of this sort of, the team wasn't really drawing well and or making money and or wasn't well capitalized? I mean, how much of that was sort of leaking out, either planted or discovered, I guess, by the press and the fans? Because, we go into 1970, there's a spring season, right, or the spring training, right? This is, I guess I want to get a little bit of an understanding of sort of how the unfolding of the team or the undoing of the team sort of kind of played out. How much was known and how much was kind of not really known by the fan base and the civic leaders around what was going on with this team.
Well, the fans knew that Sick's Stadium was not in really, really good shape. Again, there were the seats, the bleachers, the newly constructed bleachers were beginning to warp. Anybody who came out once and sat in the bleachers knew they were uncomfortable because they were just boards to sit on. The promotions that they held were not the greatest. Harold Parrott had been hired as the public relations promotions guy. He had worked for the Dodgers forever. He was old enough to have written for the Brooklyn Eagle newspaper, same one that Walt Whitman wrote for. Although I don't think he knew Walt Whitman, but. Harold Parrott was a long time major league promoter. He had worked for the Dodgers forever. He'd worked for the Angels for a couple of years. He was hired by the Pilots to get Seattle all excited about their new baseball team, and the Pilots found out that they just plain couldn't afford Harold Parrott. He was given a larger salary than he had with the Angels or with the Dodgers to lure him to Seattle. And by June, they had let him go. There's some other problems with Harold Parrott as well. There's some misfeasance, at least, story came across that I think I've conveniently forgotten. But anyway, I have a feeling that he was let go for other reasons besides his salary. But that was the main problem. They just couldn't afford him, and so they just kind of jury-rigged some promotions. The best promotion they had was a bat day in early August. 23,000 people came out. That was the top attendance. And the odd thing was, it was the same day as the hydroplanes were racing. And again, hydroplane racing is a big deal in Seattle. Not so much today, but boy, in 1969, that's the place to be, is out on Lake Washington watching the hydroplanes tool around Lake Washington. But they took a chance. They offered bats, and they had their highest attendance day on that particular Sunday. They had some family nights. They had Kiwanis night. They had Boys and Girls Clubs night, or I guess it was just in Boys Clubs nights. They didn't seem to work with the representatives of these clubs very well. And so even though the attendance got a boost, I don't think they sold as many tickets as they might have. Had the front office people been working a little bit harder and reaching out just a little bit better than they did. The total attendance for the whole year was 677,000. They had estimated that probably 800,000 was break even, and when the season started, they kind of figured they'd have 1 million. And so the 677 had to be just really, really disappointing.
So at what point does Daly start to panic?
I think he's pretty upset by the time he realizes the Kingdome or the multi-purpose stadium is not going to be built. He gets kicked around in the newspapers. The beat writer for the Seattle Times wrote a column in I guess August or early September titled "Won't You Go Home, Bill Daly?" And really chewed him out. And I'm not sure if that was the tipping point. He was already looking around for some place to move, and he had said, I'm going to give this city one more year, and we'll just see. And that's what kicked off this column. And I think by the time the column was written, William Daly was ready to find a buyer for the Pilots. Now, one of the important parts of the story is that Daly had guaranteed that he would fork up as much as $8 million to subsidize the Pilots if they ran into really tough times. Had he done that, the Pilots would have been here at least a second year. Nobody seemed to ask him for it. The American League knew that he had made at least a guarantee. He had signed a guarantee that he would at least provide 62% of that $8 million, and he had said verbally to one of the owners that he'd do the whole $8 million, and nobody held him to it. And so I think by August, certainly by September, Daly was looking around for somebody to buy the team, and by October, by the World Series, he had negotiated with Bud Selig and the Milwaukee group, the Brewer group, to sell the Pilots to Milwaukee.
Yeah, it's this is through the prism of history, right? So it's really hard to believe that. Before, basically by this, not even really by the official end of the season, everybody was, both Daly and Soriano were at the point where they would literally be reaching out to move or sell the franchise. I mean, not even after one, if you will, fully complete and post-mortemed season, right? It almost feels to me like this stadium thing, right? Because of its delay, it's not like people didn't know that this was, that the plan was going to be in the next couple of years for the stadium to eventually get built, right? I mean, why would you fritter away what took so long to get there in the first place? Why not adjust the prices, say, next year? Why not, try to make some more temporary improvements to the stadium, knowing that ultimately at the end of the road, maybe ill-defined still, that there was going to be a brand new stadium at the end of all of this.
Right, and I think most people figured by the end of 1969, early 1970, that the stadium wouldn't be built in a particularly timely manner. But still, it would surely be built. Maybe it would be possible to move in the middle of the 1973 season at the worst. So yeah, they had to last 2 or maybe 3 more seasons in order to get into the Kingdome. But that was a real hope. And one of the things is that 8 major league teams made less money than the Pilots did. Partly because the Pilots charged so much for their tickets, they did get the higher margins. They did get a good deal of money. They had better attendance than 4 teams, and then there were 4 other teams that charged maybe more reasonable ticket prices, and so the Pilots had more revenue than these other teams. And they were just ready to move. And I think it was the frustration with the way the stadium was going. It was a feeling that people in Seattle, like I said, they don't like baseball that much. Again, even today, Seattleites love winning teams if they're baseball. They don't much go out for losing teams. They'll go out for losing football teams, but not for baseball teams. And I think it was that even more stronger in 1969. There didn't seem to be a whole lot of hope. But again, if there's a villain in the book, it's Bill Daly, because he reneged on his promise to keep the Pilots around, and he could have kept them around for sure.
All right, just a couple of quick questions on this as we round third base and sliding into home, hopefully, for this conversation, which has been great because I learn a ton on these conversations, and having only lived in Seattle for about a year and a half, I'm completely naive to all of this stuff. Where was the American League and/or Major League Baseball in all of this? Right? Where is there any backstop? Is there any financial support or help, or does anybody reach out to Major League Baseball? I mean, again, you're there for not even for a season, and you've got this stadium at the end of the horizon. Why do you just abandon it so quickly? It boggles my mind, again, through the lens of history.
So the story of the final days of the pilots kind of talks about the American League. The Daly and the Sorianos had made a handshake agreement with Sea League and the Milwaukee Brewers to move the pilots to Milwaukee for the next season, which meant the 1970 season. It was sort of an open secret from October on, and Seattle sent a delegation to the next meetings later on in October, and they had a fellow. His name is Fred Dans, who was an owner of movie theaters and other recreation facilities in Seattle, and he was going to be the leader of the local folks who would buy out the pilots, who would buy the pilots from Bill Daly. He had kind of a hard time. It turned out that the Bank of California had made the pilots a $4 million loan, and they were calling in that loan. So he had to raise $4 million more than he thought he had to raise, and he just couldn't do it. The final backstop was the person that pretty clearly through all of this time, the 1960s into 1970, was the business leader of the city of Seattle. His name is Eddie Carlson. He was the head of the Westin Hotel in Seattle. He ultimately became the head of the combination of Westin and United Airlines, UAL, Incorporated, and moved away from Seattle for some time. He was really good. And he put together a consortium to replace the Dans consortium. He was probably the motivating force behind Dans. But he put together a new consortium, and he wanted it to be a non-profit, community-based consortium. And his reasoning was, there's no way that he could get people to put up enough money to buy the pilots. But if he approached them under the idea that they were doing their civic duty, they weren't buying a baseball team, but they were helping out Seattle, he could probably get the money. And he did. He got enough money from private sources. He was able to twist the arm of the Bank of California to reinstate the loan. And he went to the next final meeting, and he had enough money probably to get the pilots through most of the 1970 season. The American League didn't like the nonprofit part. I don't think most of them really understood what he was saying. I think that they believed that he was saying that every owner should run his franchise like some kind of charity sort of thing. Certainly Charlie Finley heard it that way. They deliberated, and they rejected Carlson. They gave $650,000. This is the American League. Gave $650,000 to Daly to run the team one more year. $650,000 wasn't enough. What they were hoping is that it would buy time, and they could find some other owner that would keep the pilots in Seattle. That wasn't going to work. Finally, the company that Daly and Soriano ran, Pacific Northwest Sports Incorporated, declared bankruptcy. They went to bankruptcy court. They were declared bankrupt. I guess PNSI, Pacific Northwest Sports Incorporated, they were bankrupt. The holders of that corporation were not bankrupt. Again, Daly had an obligation to pay up almost $8 million. It was pointed out during the bankruptcy trial that the American League had in its charter that if a team was declared bankrupt, the league would take over the team. The bankruptcy judge waived that provision because he said there's just no way that it's going to work out. He declared the team bankrupt, and then immediately the sale to the Brewers to Milwaukee was consummated.
But all this took all this time. I mean, all the while there was this sort of lead up to. This is the spring of 1970, right? Where I guess people, at least on the playing field, where the team were going through the motions of beginning and actually getting into a preseason. No,
they started spring training with Seattle on their uniforms, and ended it at least maybe in Peoria or Tempe, Arizona, but for sure on the field in Milwaukee on the first day of the season. The Seattle had been ripped off, and Brewers had been stitched on in its place. There is a legend. I never was able to confirm it, and I looked really hard, that the equipment truck went to Salt Lake and waited for a phone call as to whether to proceed north or to go east to Milwaukee, and the phone call came, and they turned right and went to Milwaukee. Again, I think it's a legend, but in the words of the man who shot Liberty Valance, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Yeah, well, I mean, apocryphal or not, I mean, it feels like it fits very well into this story. I mean, here's a team that got birthed relatively quickly, was hastened into its founding and its first ever season, and now its second season, similarly under weird circumstances, has literally days to kind of get going, and to the point where their uniforms were essentially, holdovers from what should have been a Seattle uniform in a new city. Mm-hmm. It's just it's mind-boggling. It's absolutely mind-boggling, this whole story of how this current iteration of the Brewers came to be, how the Pilots sort of came and went. But all right, so let's get into, and I'm sure we'll go into this much more deeply in future conversations. But let's slide into home, shall we say, to strain the analogy further, into what sort of comes out of all this, because it wasn't all bad at the end of the day. But what transpires after the Pilots have left? Is there a huge outcry in the city? Are people just really upset? Is they're weeping in the streets like the Brooklyn Dodgers when they left for L.A., or not? And what then became of this stadium thing? And maybe you can kind of, obviously, it seems like the coda occurs in 1976 when Major League Baseball keeps, a promise, or comes back again, perhaps this time, obviously, for good.
So in Seattle, I would describe it as consternation and finger pointing. And the sports writers, for sure, were upset. They didn't have a team any longer, and it didn't kill their jobs, but they wanted a team desperately. For the people of Seattle, it was embarrassing to lose a major league team after 1 year. The Seattle, which felt like it had made a step to become literally major league, had lost its major league status. So that was really embarrassing. The finger pointing, people pointed at the owners, people pointed at the fans, people pointed at the city. There's blame to go all the way around. I mean, there are just all kinds of things that went wrong for the Pilots. Some of those things an expansion team could expect and could survive. All of them together, probably not. But finally, the unwillingness of Daly to extend it another season, that's where I point my finger. But he's not the sole culprit by any means. Sort of in the background is the building of the Kingdome, and as I said before, it didn't get finished until 1976. So Seattle really couldn't genuinely try to attract another team to replace the Pilots and then put it in six stadiums. Six stadiums stood until 1979. They held rock concerts and farmers markets and things like that in it. And then finally, it was torn down, and at its site now is a Lowe's home improvement store. But there's still signs outside, and there's a home plate just inside the doors of the store. The big thing, though, was that when Seattle lost the pilots, the bankruptcy hearing was over, they filed a lawsuit against the American League. The bankruptcy judge said, you are enjoined against filing a lawsuit against Pacific Northwest Sports Incorporated. You can't sue the pilots. You can't sue the corporation. But that left everything else open, and so they sued the American League. The state of Washington, the King County, the city of Seattle joined together to sue the league, and all of that was supposed to be leverage for a new team. And so there was a long period of investigation and interviewing and drawing everything together. But the trial didn't start until 1976. So there's a 6-year lapse between when the pilots left and when the case actually went to trial. There were some complications, but what the leaders of the people who are bringing suit said is that we can just get the owners of the American League in front of a jury, we're going to win this case. They were pretty much right. The Seattle hired just an excellent attorney to represent them, or the city, the county, and the state. An excellent attorney to represent them. He made the owners look foolish. Even Charlie Finley admitted that he felt foolish when he was on the stand being questioned by this attorney, William Dwyer. The trial went on for about a week, 10 days. The American League knew that it was going to lose this part of the trial. They knew they had a pretty good idea if they appealed it that finally they would win, but they didn't want to go through the process of the whole trial. And so they granted Seattle a new team. So basically what the state and the county and the city did was settle out of court for the Mariners.
Well, that's also interesting, too, because during that period of time, from the pilot's departure to that trial and then the ultimate awarding of Major League Baseball, you had two other sports franchises and leagues come into the mix that augured for even more solidification of this looming new Kingdome structure downtown, or no, sorry, not downtown, down south of downtown. The Seattle Sounders of the North American Soccer League, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, actually wound up becoming the first ever event in the Kingdome's history, if I'm not mistaken. I could be.
The first sports event, I think. The first event was sort of an inaugural gala with all kinds of entertainers.
There you go.
Basically, just to see if they could work the traffic and the parking.
Sure, and then obviously the Seattle Seahawks, right, along with Tampa Bay in the NFL. So a lot changed, right, in those intervening 5 or 6 years, strangely and almost ironically, where baseball was not necessarily even the first thought around this new structure, ironically, right?
That's right, yeah. The National Football League by 1976, I think there's a pretty good argument that it had become the premier sport in the United States. In 1969, there was no question about it. It was baseball. You know, the NFL was really interesting, but baseball was still America's pastime. By 1976, the NFL was well along if it hadn't already become America's pastime. So the idea of getting the Seahawks was really great for Seattleites. And again, Seattle just seems to be a football city for whatever reason. It was a love affair with the Huskies for a really long time, and then when the Seahawks came, the love affair turned to the Seahawks and continues to today. The Mariners are really clearly the second team in town for Major League sports.
Okay, so let me ask you this sort of general question as a capper here, and then we'll let you do some promotion for the book. This has been great. The state of Seattle professional sports now, right? I mean, it just seems like it's teeming, right? The Seattle Sounders, obviously a very successful franchise on a number of different levels. You've got obviously a well-regarded Seattle Seahawks football team, the Mariners, with their relatively new dedicated stadium. And now the arrival of perhaps the most expensive NHL expansion franchise ever. And I think a lot of people still sort of chafe at the Sonics leaving and perhaps NBA basketball finally coming back. It seems to me that Seattle is very much in and of itself a sports town. And then some now. Are there any lessons that sort of came out of this pilot's experience that maybe led to this? Or what do you think it was just inevitable given the size of the city and the growth of its population and the inevitability of it becoming, quote unquote, major league?
Yeah, I think since the mid to late 60s, Seattle has taken 1, 2, or 3 quantum leaps toward being a truly major league city. Where Boeing was the primary employer in Seattle in the 1960s, there's just a really long list. Amazon, Microsoft, Starbucks, Costco, and more that makes Seattle. And so one of the things that I say in my book is that major league cities become major league because they have an effect on their hinterland. They become economically robust, and that's what draws the major league teams into the city. And that's what's happened to Seattle, is that it has become a city that doesn't need the Sonics. People would love to have the Sonics or something like that back, but it wasn't a slap in the face of Seattle. Seattle was a confident city 13 years ago or 10 years ago when the Sonics left. It was an awful thing, but it wasn't as though Seattle was just a lesser city because the Sonics had left. The NBA, as far as Seattleites concerned, is just a lesser league because the Sonics left.
Yeah, well, that's a story I want to get into too. Is the whole Sonics and the hijacking of that story and that team, and it's the greener pastures supposedly of Oklahoma City. And please, no emails from you Oklahoma fans. All right, so Bill, this has been awesome. Give us some promo here. Now's your chance about the book, what you and even what you have planned for other endeavors in and around sports, if any. For our audience to listen and hear about?
Well, the name of the book is Becoming Big League, Seattle, the Pilots, and Stadium Politics. It was published by the University of Washington Press, and I checked today just in case. It's still available on Amazon. And so if people are interested in kind of filling in some of the things that we haven't talked about, there's plenty more detail in the book. I think that's about it. As far as me, I've retired from my retirement. I'm doing some volunteer work, but as far as researching, boy, it would have to be really good. I've been thinking about with the coming of the hockey team. Wouldn't it be wonderful to write about the Stanley Cup winning Seattle Metropolitans? But it just seems like too much work. So I'm not sure if I have any more sports articles in me.
Well, look, if you want to be on this show again, you better damn well get working on that book, because I think it'll absolutely be relevant. And frankly, look, and we talk about this a lot on this show. It's interesting to see sort of modern day sports and the leagues and the teams, and in certain situations there is a warm, fuzzy, and solid embrace of the past. I think the Seattle Sounders are a really good example, but arguably, say, Major League Soccer, not necessarily warmly embracing of, say, the old North American Soccer League, where the original Sounders franchise began. So we see this and feel this tension between that which came in the past with the big modern, big money pro sports machinery that exists today. It almost feels to me sometimes that the history of sports and teams and leagues, especially those no longer with us, are more conveniently remembered than they are sort of deeply and richly. And if it were up to me, I would absolutely want to go deep on that the story of Seattle and the history of hockey there before the arrival of this to-be-named team. So, for what it's worth, here's a little ounce of encouragement coming from our little podcast board here, and perhaps some of our listeners too might rally around that cause. But we do appreciate this work and this conversation. I learned a lot, and I look forward to hopefully getting some more information about this team and more of Seattle sports, because there's plenty more to explore for sure.
Well, thank you very much for having me with you. I really enjoyed talking about the Pilots once again. It's a really interesting time in the history of Seattle and in the history of baseball, I think.
Well, there you have it. Our thanks to Bill for, an interesting investigation into a team that has always been a curiosity to me, and I suspect to many of our listeners as well. And I hope that we go to some other conversational explorations about this team and this year and this league, the American League, the Seattle Pilots. I especially would love to talk to Jim Bouton at some point. Obviously, Ball 4, the sort of iconic work, not only of baseball, but his year with the Seattle Pilots. Hopefully, we can get him on a future episode if he is willing and able. But in the meantime, your homework assignment is to buy a copy of Bill Mullins' book. And it's called, again, Becoming Big League, Seattle, the Pilots, and Stadium Politics. It is published by the University of Washington Press. And, of course, you can buy it wherever you find good books. But, of course, if you'd like to give us a little love in your pursuit of that book, by all means, please go to goodseatsstillavailable.com, our little website devoted to the show. You'll find all the old episodes and all the other stuff about this show. But also, where this episode listing, just search it up, and you'll find a link to this book from that little link. And by doing so, you'll give us a little shekel or two, and we appreciate that, of course. And yes, goodseatsstillavailable.com is the place to check out all of our great stuff, our great sponsors. You'll see some imagery and some other fun stuff, and we're always building more attractions there beyond, of course, every single episode of this little show, as we almost get close to the century mark of the number of episodes we've done. And oh my God, I can't believe we've done this, so many of these already, but we look forward to making more of them for sure. It's also the place you can find out all of our social media places. You can find us on Twitter at Good Seats Still. You'll find us at Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. There is a Facebook page devoted to our little show. You can find us there. What else? You can send us some email, of course. You can say directly to us or click from the website. But if you want to do it directly, that's hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And it's all good. And we appreciate your checking us out, bookmarking us, and interacting with us on social media, your suggestions, your comments, all of that stuff we love. We also love our friend Jerry Payne, in a platonic way, of course, and his team at Podfly Productions. He and they are the ones that are carefully crafting all of our little bits and pieces to make this sound somewhat like a decent and entertaining show. And if you want to learn more about them and their services, if you're interested in podcasting generally, by all means, check them out. They are at podfly.net. Okay, we're going to leave you with not only our thanks and our well wishes until next week. We're going to leave you with, as we promised at the top of the show, the full song. Yes, the Seattle Pilots had their own theme song. They were only around for a year, but they had a really cool theme song, and it's on, of course, the Pilotoon record label. It's the official song of Seattle Pilots. It's called Go, Go, You Pilots. It was written by Ron Belcher, who is a well-known sports broadcaster in the Seattle area, and it went under the pseudonym of Doris Doubleday and his command pilots. Here it is, as we send you off into the ether. Go, go, you pilots. Take care, everybody.
Go, go, you pilots, you proud Seattle team. Go, go, you pilots, go out and build a dream. You brought the majors to the evergreen Northwest. Now go, go, you pilots, you're going to be the best. suits and all. Red Sox and Royals from April till the fall. American Leaguers, you've got what's known as class. So welcome to Seattle, it's going to be a gas. Go, 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 go. Now go, go, you pilots, you're going to be the best. White Sox and Tigers, the Angels and the A's. See them at the ballpark on those good old summer days. Orioles and Senators, the Indians and Twins. Our pilots ask no favors as they battle you for wins. So go, go, you pilots, you proud Seattle team. Go, go, you pilots, it's time to shout and scream.